A paradox, also known as an antinomy, is a logically self-contradictory statement or a statement that runs contrary to one's expectation. It is a statement that, despite apparently valid reasoning from true premises, leads to a seemingly self-contradictory or a logically unacceptable conclusion. We have another 5 paradox in our list. Number 1. The dichotomy paradox. Imagine that you're about to set off walking down a street. To reach the other end, you'd first have to walk halfway there. And to walk halfway there, you'd first have to walk a quarter of the way there. And to walk a quarter of the way there, you'd first have to walk an eighth of the way there. And before that a 16th of the way there, and then a 32nd of the way there, a 64th of the way there, and so on. Ultimately, in order to perform even the simplest of tasks like walking down a street, you'd have to perform an infinite number of smaller tasks, something that, by definition, is utterly impossible. Not only that, but no matter how small the first part of the journey is said to be, it can always be halved to create another task. The only way in which it cannot be halved would be to consider the first part of the journey to be of absolutely no distance whatsoever, and in order to complete the task of moving no distance whatsoever, you can't even start your journey in the first place. Number 2. The Fletcher's paradox. Imagine if Fletcher has fired one of his arrows into the air. For the arrow to be considered to be moving, it has to be continually repositioning itself from the place where it is now to any place where it currently isn't. The Fletcher's paradox, however, states that throughout its trajectory the arrow is actually not moving at all. At any given instant of no real duration, in other words, a snapshot in time, during its flight, the arrow cannot move to somewhere it isn't because there isn't time for it to do so. And it can't move to where it is now, because it's already there. So, for that instant in time, the arrow must be stationary. But because all time is comprised entirely of instants, in every one of which the arrow must also be stationary, then the arrow must in fact be stationary the entire time. Except, of course, it isn't. Number 3. The potato paradox. Imagine that a farmer has a sack containing 100 pounds of potatoes. The potatoes, he discovers, are comprised of 99% water and 1% solids, so he leaves them in the heat of the sun for a day to let the amount of water in them reduce to 98%. But when he returns to them the day after, he finds his 100-pound sack now weighs just 50 pounds. How can this be true? Well, if 99% of 100 pounds of potatoes is water, then the water must weigh 99 pounds. The 1% of solids must ultimately weigh just 1 pound, giving a solids to liquids of 1:99. But if the potatoes are allowed to dehydrate to 98% water, the solids must now account for 2% of the weight, that is 2:98, or 1:49, even though the solids must still only weigh 1 pound. The water, ultimately, must now weigh 49 pounds, giving a total weight of 50 pounds despite just a 1% reduction in water content. Or must it? Although not a true paradox in the strictest sense, the counterintuitive potato paradox is a famous example of what is known as a vertical paradox, in which a basic theory is taken to a logical but apparently absurd conclusion. Number 4. The Raven paradox. Also known as Hampel's paradox, for the German logician who proposed it in the mid-1940s, the Raven paradox begins with the apparently straightforward and entirely true statement that all ravens are black. This is matched by a logically contrapositive, that is negative and contradictory, statement that everything that is not black is not a raven, which, despite seeming like a fairly unnecessary point to make, is also true given that we know all ravens are black. Hampel argues that whenever we see a black raven, this provides evidence to support the first statement. But by extension, whenever we see anything that is not black, like an apple, this too must be taken as evidence supporting the second statement. After all, an apple is not black, and nor is it a raven. The paradox here is that Hampel has apparently proved that seeing an apple provides us with evidence, no matter how unrelated it may seem, that ravens are black. It's the equivalent of saying that you live in New York is evidence that you don't live in Los Angeles, or that saying you are 30 years old is evidence that you are not 29. Just how much information can one statement actually imply? Number 5. Galileo's Paradox of the Infinite. In his final written work, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, 1638, the legendary Italian polymath Galileo Galilei proposed a mathematical paradox based on the relationships between different sets of numbers. On the one hand, he proposed, there are square numbers, like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. On the other, there are those numbers that are not squares, like 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and so on. Put these two groups together, and surely there have to be more numbers in general than there are just square numbers, or, to put it another way, the total number of square numbers must be less than the total number of square and non-square numbers together. However, because every positive number has to have a corresponding square and every square number has to have a positive number as its square root, there cannot possibly be more of one than the other. Confused? You're not the only one. In his discussion of his paradox, Galileo was left with no alternative than to conclude that numerical concepts like more, less, or fewer can only be applied to finite sets of numbers, and as there are an infinite number of square and non-square numbers, these concepts simply cannot be used in this context.